When you think of ancient Greece, you can't help but also think of a certain body part. The ancients were quite fascinated with the phallus. They'd craft little penis effigies, totems called fascinum, which symbolized the divine phallus. A common feature in fertility festivals and Dionysian celebrations were big penis parades known as phallic processions. Wine-drunk revelers would march with penis puppets, ding-a-ling singing ding-dong songs about schlongs and whistling willy-nilly jokes about their willies. This tradition is still in effect today, where actual people in the actual modern world use history as an excuse to have a penis parade. A sort of Renaissance festival for the pecker. A Comic-Con for well, you know where that's going. Aristotle, one of the major philosophers in today's episode, wrote about these phallic festivities. He hypothesized that the birth of comedy began from these penis parades. If this is true, if all comedy began from these celebrations, and all major philosophy today is rooted in the tradition started from the theories of the ancients, well, you might as well say that Aristotle and Plato are the phallic processions of Western philosophy. This is the timeline of Western philosophy. Hi everyone, I'm Brad, and boy, I really wish I had a whistle right now because I am going to be your grand marshal in this phallic procession of Western philosophy. In this episode, we'll cover a group of thinkers commonly referred to as the ancients. These guys are the real big hitters. They're true philosophical pros, the absolute units of Western philosophy. But before we jump right in, let's set the stage a little bit. Where are we on the timeline and how did we get here? Ancient Greece was a collection of city-states, each with their own individual identity. These city-states would unite from time to time to combat outside invaders. One of these coalitions would spark a golden age. The Delian League, a name we give for the group of city-states which defeated the invading Persian forces, became the basis for a new Greek state headquartered in Athens. Flush with cash, this new Greece, led by a statesman known as Pericles, would come to fund many cultural achievements. They built the Acropolis, pumped up their naval might, and funded half the population on the government payroll. It's around this time that these big-time philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle popped up on the scene. Okay, so enough with the history lesson. Why should we even care about these thinkers? These guys came from a period so long ago. There's no way they got much, if anything, right at all. I mean, these people used to smear mule feces on a woman's stomach to help prevent miscarriage. So, they had a lot to learn. But don't let the weird culture of a more primitive man turn you off from their thoughts. After all, we do share the same brain and the same intellectual capacity. And as we learned in the last episode, the pre-Socratic thinkers would come to introduce many of the first ideas in philosophy. But it's in this age, the age of the ancients, where things really get cooking. It's through the work of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that many of the traditions of Western philosophy begin. These men created the culture of thinking. Philosophy of the ancients is philosophy of the West. We crowned Socrates as the Philosopher King of the first episode introducing this series. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend you go check it out. So in order to not rehash that content, it's best we move right along to Plato, the student of Socrates. Remember, we don't have the direct writings of Socrates. The vast majority of our knowledge of Socrates comes from the work of his pupil, Plato. It might be more fair to refer to the previous thinkers not as pre-Socratics, but as pre-Platonics. It's really hard to overstate the influence of Plato. Alfred Whitehead, perhaps the most appropriately named person of all time, noted that all of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. So, yeah, he's kind of like a big deal. Plato was born into a wealthy family. Like most ancient thinkers that had enough leisure time to wonder about the nature of the universe and not be toiling in the fields. By most accounts, it seems like Plato was a pretty cool dude. His contemporaries remarked on his sweet voice, which was as delicate as a lily, and the overall affability of the man. When his role model Socrates was sentenced to death, Plato spent a decade wandering around the world, trying to find peace in his quest for wisdom. He would eventually come across the disciples of Pythagoras. More on him in the last episode. It's through them that Plato's interest in mathematics would flourish. Last time we learned about metaphysics, or the study of the true nature of reality. Plato has a lot to say about metaphysics, but like many philosophers, his theories of the world are deeply tied to his theories of how we can know the world. Philosophers have a word for everything, including this, but it's quite a mouthful, so we've brought in some extra flair to help keep our definition interesting. One small note, to appease Disney's lawyers, we added a necessary bit of legalese. Definitions, but with lightsabers. The word epistemology comes from the Greek root episteme, meaning knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What does it mean to say we know something? What's knowledge and what's a belief? How do we know what we know? How do we know we know we know? And how do we know what we know when we know how we know it? The philosophy of epistemology wasn't really a formal concept at the time of Plato, but he definitely made the distinction between the study of what exists and the study of what we know. Plato had a lot of big ideas, but perhaps his biggest was his theory of forms. This idea might be the first of many in an intro course to philosophy that gets you to roll your eyes, but it's really important to give it a fair shake. Plato wanted to know how we have knowledge or ideas about the world. Think about a circle. In the real world, no perfect circle exists. We can see a pizza and recognize it as a circle, despite it actually being an oval, or at least not perfectly circular. Even the most precise circular objects in our world aren't even perfectly circular. A perfect circle only exists as an idea. The perfect circle in our minds is the form of a circle, and it exists separately as part of the universe's ultimate reality of forms. When we see a dog, we know it's a dog, even if it's the first time we've ever seen that dog. How is that even possible? We can look at 4 unique dogs, all radically different, and still see them as dogs. What makes a dog a dog? You could try to describe the features of the dog. You could say it's a 4-legged, fluffy, barking animal that loves bacon. But what if a dog lost its legs in an accident? Is this 3-legged dog still a dog? Or what if it's a naked Peruvian breed? That's a dog, right? What if it's not even a real animal, but a stuffed animal dog? Is that a dog? Despite all these differences, all these objects in the world represent the form of a dog that exists in the ultimate reality of ideas. According to Plato, the perfect dog doesn't exist in the real world. But maybe he would have changed his mind had he seen this episode's adorable animal intermission. Let's take a quick mental break and enjoy. Plato gave us one of philosophy's weirdest, but perhaps most memorable analogies to describe his theory of forms. Imagine a cave where prisoners are chained to some rocks. They've lived here their entire lives and have never seen anything other than the wall directly in front of them. Behind them is a fire flickering. Objects and people in the world are interacting near this fire, but the prisoners can't see any of that. They can only see the shadows those objects make on the wall in front of them. To the prisoners, all they know are these shadows. These shadows are to them all that is real. But what if one of the more curious prisoners escaped? They journeyed out of the cave and discovered the world outside. At first, the light of the sun is too bright for their eyes. But after enough exposure, they come to see the real world and realize the world of the cave is just an illusion. When the escaped prisoner returns, they discover that their former peers don't want to learn about this outside world. They might ridicule this enlightened prisoner. They might even seek to destroy him, like in the case with Socrates. For Plato, the cave is a representation of the everyday knowledge and understanding we have of the world. When we claim to know things based on our everyday observations of them, using our sense information such as sights and sounds, we are only truly perceiving their shadows. But maybe a cave analogy is a bit of a stretch for our modern sensibilities. What if there's a more recent example to drive home Plato's point? This brings us to this episode's movie moment.
And now for our feature presentation.
Fair warning, we're about to take a deep dive into The Matrix. Spoiler warning if you haven't seen it. But if you haven't seen this movie by now, come on, it's been over 20 years. The Matrix is a movie about a messiah figure who escapes a computer simulation and discovers that the real world outside has been dominated by robots. The computers have trapped humans in a computer simulation, tricking them into thinking they are living normal lives at the turn of the millennium. This simulation is Plato's cave. What people are seeing are but mere shadows and computer representations of the real world. The philosopher is given a choice: red pill,
you take the red pill,
or blue pill, see reality or stay in the shadows. The Matrix also shows us how knowledge of true reality is too much for some. The character Cypher has seen the light, has explored outside the cave, but given the harsh reality, would prefer the land of senses and shadows. But Plato wasn't just about caves and forms. It'd take many hours to go through all of his major ideas. For the sake of time, we can paint Plato as a thinker that's pretty different from the standard ideas of our time. For instance, he was very suspicious of art. He thought it amounted to little more than a representation of a form. But maybe the most controversial of his ideas concerns his thoughts on democracy. We live in an age of democracy. For many people of the world, democracy is just a given. It's the best thing we've got. Plato wasn't so convinced. For him, democracy often becomes mob rule, following the whims of the masses rather than pursuing the common and collective good. Democracies are often run by idiots or fools.
Middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
Democratic society produces a democratic man who is more interested in money than in goodness. It's hard to disagree with many of these points, but Plato's proposal to fix the situation is a little bit far-fetched. He argues for a highly segregated society, ruled by a class of Philosopher Kings. Which brings us to this episode's segment of Philosopher King.
I know how hard it is. America's dead.
Despite his differences with our contemporary time, the crown would normally go to such a big thinker as Plato. He would be the one true king. But this episode is different. For this episode, we will make a rare exception. Instead of one true king, there's a tie. That's because if there's any doubt whether Plato is the most influential philosopher of all time, it's definitely coming from the influence of his pupil, a man named Aristotle. Aristotle's work is in large part a response to Plato, and it's in his ideas where we will find more similarities to modern day. Born near Macedonia, or as Dan Carlin says, Macedonia, Aristotle had quite the prestigious life. His father was the physician to the king, which opened the door for Aristotle to tutor a little-known figure you might have heard of called Alexander the Great. Aristotle began with Plato's philosophy, but as the Platonic school began to focus more and more on forms and mathematics, Aristotle began to develop his own more grounded philosophy. Whereas Plato would want to think of abstract ideas and mathematics, Aristotle was more concerned with topics like biology. Even today, you can see more mathematical thinkers gravitate to Plato, and the more scientific types leaning toward Aristotle. In today's time, where science dominates, you can see the appreciation for Aristotle more readily among professional philosophers. Unlike Plato, Aristotle was a fan of knowledge we gain from the senses. To him, they help us gain a better understanding of things. The world isn't just forms, according to Aristotle, but a combination of form and matter. Matter describes a thing's potential. A child has the potential to become an adult. A rock has the potential to sink in water. Matter shows us the potential. Forms show us the actual. They describe what a thing is at that time. To become a man, the child has to actualize to the form of the man. Aristotle's most lasting contribution probably comes in his development of the syllogism. This episode has already had two Philosopher Kings, so why not a second definition with lightsabers? However, in between the recording of the last segment, I have been instructed again by our lawyers to add more legalese around these terms. Definitions, but with lightsabers. The word syllogism comes from the Greek syllogismos, which means conclusion or inference. It's a type of deductive logic where we arrive at a conclusion based on previous statements. Aristotle provides us with the classic textbook example of 3 lines. The first line, all men are mortal. Alright, nothing controversial here. Next line, a following preposition, Socrates is a man. Okay, this checks out as well. And then a final third line. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. A syllogistic argument is where we reach the third line by way of the first 2. The breakthrough of the syllogism is classic Aristotle. Plato is over here talking about caves and forms and highfalutin ultimate reality, and Aristotle just hits us with some basic transitive property. His ethics also share a similar simplicity. For Aristotle, the goal of a good life is happiness. That doesn't just mean pleasure-seeking happiness, but true happiness. A type of happiness brought on by a life of reason. Philosophy helps us live that life. One of his tools of ethical thinking is what Aristotle develops as the mean. Think of Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold. How should man control his desires? For instance, how should man control his desire for food? Desire it too much and he becomes a glutton. Desire it not at all and he becomes an ascetic and unable to appreciate the pleasures of food. Man should desire it in the middle, in a type of temperance, a state of moderation. Aristotle is aware that this won't cover everything. There are some actions which are good or bad, regardless of how down the middle you are. It's hard to find the golden mean of murder, for instance, but his model of not too much, not too little was very useful for Aristotle. He extends it to his political thinking. Unlike Plato, Aristotle thinks there are several sufficient ways to run a society. The proper society finds the Goldilocks zone for whichever strategy it ultimately chooses. If one person is to rule a society well, he can be an efficient monarch, but if he rules excessively, he becomes a tyrant, putting his good above the whole. If only a few are to rule society, this can actually work out ultimately if a noble aristocracy works towards the welfare of all. But if they begin to think only of themselves, an oligarchy of profit seekers forms. If the government relies not on the one or the few, but instead on the many, this can work out as well. When done well, you would end up with a polity, a forum of differing opinions. Done not so well, then you have Aristotle actually agreeing with Plato. The bad form of the rule of the many is a democracy, or mob rule. Aristotle and Plato form a 1-2 punch of ancient thinking. Any list of top philosophers must have Aristotle and Plato at least in the top 5. More often than not, they are ranked first and second. This is why ancient philosophy is really a tale of two philosophies. A tale of two philosophies. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Ancient Greece gave us two titans of philosophy, but also established the two poles of thinking that philosophers seem to bounce back and forth between. As we will come to see, different periods of philosophy tend to lean in the direction of either Platonic or Aristotelian thinking. Eras concerned with things such as higher forms, ideals, mathematics, big picture stuff, tend to lean in the direction of Plato. And ages that are concerned with bottom-up, material world, science, and logic tend to favor Aristotle. But this period has so much to offer, and it's not only about Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately, we only have so much time, so to get through as much great thought as we can, we'll cover it in this episode's Rapid Fire. Rapid Fire. We cover as much philosophy as we can in the time allotted. Counter set? Go. There was a popular, noble, and lovable philosopher known as Epicurus who furthered a philosophy known as hedonism. Today, we think of hedonists as these depraved people, but Epicurus's main point was that we should see pleasure as good and pain as bad. Unlike the hedonism of today, think sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or basically any popular Instagram account, Epicurus thought that the most pleasurable life was one of moderation, which brought about more pleasure in the long run. Eat one cookie, good. Eat many cookies, you start to feel bad. Then there's Diogenes. the most gangster of all philosophers. He was a troll of epic proportion. During the day, he would go around squinting while carrying a lamp, claiming to others that he was looking for an honest man. He would bring food to lectures to try to distract people. He even trolled the most powerful man of the time, Alexander the Great. Alright, so normally the very rigid laws of rapid fire would have us stop here. But in an episode of Extras, we have to allow for more time to discuss the exchange between Alexander and Diogenes. In the spirit of rapid fire, we must honor the true fire spit by Diogenes. According to legend, one day Alexander came upon Diogenes basking in the morning sun. Alexander, thrilled to meet the celebrity thinker, asked the philosopher if there was any favor he could do for him. Diogenes quickly responded with, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The stunned Alexander, impressed by the man's boldness, said, "If I were not Alexander, then I should wish to be Diogenes." Doubling down, Diogenes quipped, "If I were not Diogenes, I would still wish to be Diogenes." He then pretended to dig around where he was sitting. Alexander asked why. Diogenes explained, "I am searching for the bones of your father, but I cannot distinguish them from those of a slave." This was to the most powerful man in the world and one of the most powerful men of all time. As the Greek state was absorbed by Macedonia and then later the Roman Republic and the eventual Roman Empire, Greek thought and philosophy transformed and was often overlooked for other intellectual pursuits like statecraft and epic poetry. In the next episode, we'll cover how new religious ideas and ideologies totally transform and revolutionize Western philosophy. So, don't forget to say your prayers, because we're going right back to Sunday school in a deep dive on God and his impact on Western philosophy. Amen.